Good morning, everyone. Reading will be from Luke chapter 15, and this is kind of at the conclusion of the parable of the lost son, where the son finally comes to his senses and realizes that he should probably go back to his father after he's lived a life of sin and made a lot of mistakes, but he can always go back. So from verse 20 on, it reads, So he got up and went to his father. But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion for him. He ran to his son, threw his arms around him, and kissed him. The son said to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. But the father said to his servants, Quick, bring the best robe and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. Bring the fattened calf and kill it. Let's have a feast and celebrate. For this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found. So they began to celebrate.
Thank you, Stefan. Good morning. It's good to see you. It's a good week. I see we have some guests today with us. We're glad that you're with us, and we hope that you will be blessed by the morning, and we are certainly blessed by having you with us today. It's good to have some of our college students back. Some are still going to be coming back this week, but we have some that have returned, and we're glad to have them with us as well. Let me go ahead and turn your Bibles to Hebrews chapter 4. A few years ago, Shirley Harper was struggling in her marriage with Jim. The problem had been long-standing. Marriage just hadn't turned out the way she had envisioned it to be. There was no close relationship between them at all. In fact, the air was tense most of the time, or at least that's the way she described it. She said, I just feel like I'm walking on eggshells all the time. That was the way she felt. She was afraid to talk to him about anything that might involve church or faith or religion. It was just a subject that was not acceptable to bring up. In fact, there were a lot of subjects that were taboo, and she was afraid to talk with them about them or bring up these subjects because they always brought a negative and sometimes loud result. And so she just kind of clammed up. She certainly didn't dare to talk to him about her frustrations, about her dissatisfaction, about her unhappiness, and about her fears. And so she just about decided to leave him. In her first session with a marriage counselor friend of mine, my friend asked her if she had ever told him how she felt. Well, she hadn't. She was afraid to, you see. And so it was suggested to her that she look for an opportunity to talk with him about it, even in spite of her fears, because, after all, how bad could it get? She was planning on leaving him anyway, so what could he do to her that would be worse than that? Besides, it was suggested she owed it to him to give him at least a chance to prove her wrong in her fears. Now, I was aware of Shirley's and Jim's struggles. But I actually moved away to another state before all of that was resolved. I didn't see Shirley for 4 years. But when I saw her, the first thing she wanted to talk to me about was Jim. She said, he's just terrific. She said, the past 4 years have been marvelous. She said, we share our deepest thoughts with each other, and we just don't hold anything from each other. Shirley had the marriage that she had longed for all of her life, but she was too afraid to pursue. Now, over the years, I've known several people like Shirley, both male and female. They walk on eggshells with each other, rather than sharing from the depths of their soul with each other. They always are afraid. But I've also known just as many who live unbearably crippled lives religiously, spiritually, because of the fact they feel as though they must walk on eggshells before God. And that's what I want to talk about today. Our text is from Hebrews chapter 4. The author begins by telling us something that's kind of startling, if you've never heard it before. Nothing in all creation is hidden from God's sight. Everything is uncovered and laid bare before the eyes of Him to whom we must give an account. Now, if he stopped right there, it would be daunting. But he goes on. He says, therefore, since we have a great high priest who has gone through the heavens, Jesus the Son of God, let us hold firmly to the faith we profess. For we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, but we have one who has been tempted in every way just as we are, yet without sin. This is absolutely one of my favorite texts because of the reassurance it gives me for my own plight. That I can draw before God knowing that there's someone there who understands. We have inherited a whole lot of paganism, pagan concepts. The vast majority of pagan deities ruled by terror as the prime motivational force. Almost without exception, that's true. If you go to the Old Testament, you find the god Molech is mentioned numerous times. And Molech was a deity that demanded children to be sacrificed to the fire. In other words, they were offered as burnt offerings before the god Molech. They were put on the grill by their parents. Parents just like us who loved their children. But they walked in terror before Molech. And it was in terror that they carried out these atrocities against their little ones. They're no different from us. But these pagan deities of the Canaanite world in which Israel was living, they sacrificed their children as a burnt offering. Baal was another one you read about a lot in the Old Testament. Baal was a Canaanite god who demanded lascivious offerings to appease his wrath and to bring about the promise of harvest. And there were a variety of others like that. Edith Hamilton's Mythology is one of the most fascinating books I ever read. And I read it as a freshman in college. It was required reading. And it's about the Greek and Roman deities. And each of these ruled by fear. And the object was to appease their wrath. Someone didn't serve these gods because they loved these gods. They weren't attracted by the warmth of these gods, but they were dodging always in terror from these deities. And most of them were unscrupulous. They had just outlandish personalities in the legend, in the folklore. But people, they shuddered before them in fear. The great superstitions of the underdeveloped lands today, one finds much the same thing. People honor deities that call them to huddle in fear. Well, much of this superstition that goes all the way back to Canaan, to the Romans, to the Greeks, to the pagan worlds of today, much of that superstition, unfortunately, finds its way into Christianity, into the way it's fleshed out in people's lives, into our understanding of God. I'm using the term "our" in a very generic sense, but I want you to hear this. When I was in college, I went every Tuesday to a nursing home in which I would read to some of the retired people there. They were individuals who couldn't read a whole lot on their own, and so I would read the Bible to them. And it was not a big group, it was a dozen or so. And every Tuesday evening they'd gather in the dining hall and I'd read to them for about an hour. They would have a memory verse. They look forward to these events. Well, there was one lady there, just the sweetest little thing. She seemed to have a knowledge of the Bible better than most. She was very mentally alert. She took part in the discussion actively. She always had a memory verse. But one evening, she just blindsided me. She explained to me in rather matter-of-fact terms that there are two gods, she said. Two gods. Well, I thought she was talking about God and Satan, and of course that's bad theology, but that's what I thought she meant. No, that's not what she meant at all. She went on to explain. She explained there's an evil God and a good God, and the evil God used to be in control, but he was overthrown by the good God, and that was Jesus, and now he's in control. Well, that was the most outrageous thing I'd ever heard in my life. But I want you to know that over the years since then, I've heard this idea or something similar to it quite a number of times. The bottom line of what I've heard is that invariably it boils down to a very confused, distorted image of God in which the Father and the Son are pitted as rivals of each other. And you'd be surprised how many people who think of God that way. The Father is old and crotchety and stern. He's a God of hard justice. And then there's the Son who's loving and kind and forgiving. And they are rivals of each other. Well, the Father is, of course, the one we don't know quite as well. And that which we don't know, we fear. And sometimes we fear in a very unhealthy sense because we don't understand. Jesus made a great effort to paint another picture of God. He wanted us to understand His Father as He understood His Father. First of all, by the words He spoke, He tried to paint a new picture of God. When He taught His disciples to pray, He taught His disciples to pray, Our Father. He didn't teach them to pray with some kind of stern address or distant address or cold address, such as Your Honor or Your Majesty or Your Highness, but rather a very intimate and warm address, Father. Actually, the language is actually warmer than that. Perhaps more comparable to our colloquial daddy. He taught His disciples to come before their daddy. Well, that, unfortunately, is not the image that much of the world had of God in that day. And unfortunately, that's not the image that much of the world has of God today. When He was talking with Nicodemus, who came to Him by night, you remember, He told Nicodemus of the love that God has for the world. He didn't talk to Nicodemus about the expectations that God has of the world, or the demands that God has placed on the world, or the orders that God has given him for the world, but He talked to Nicodemus about the love that God has for the world, the sacrifice that God is making for the world, the giving that God is doing for the world. Not what He's wanting the world to give to Him, but what He is wanting to give to mankind, to humankind. So Jesus painted a picture of His Father with words, but He also painted a picture with the stories He told, the parables. The one read a few moments ago is perhaps the most graphic of all, from Luke 15. It's often referred to as the parable of the prodigal son, but it's probably more accurately called the parable of the waiting father, because it's as much or more about the father than it is about the son. And notice, while he, that is the son, was still a long way off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion for him, and he ran to his son and threw his arms around him and he kissed him. The son said to him, Father, I've sinned against heaven and against you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. But the father said to the servant, Quick, bring our best robe and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. Bring the fattened calf and kill it. Let us have a feast and celebrate. For this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found. And so they began to celebrate. And then Jesus painted a different picture also of his Father by the life he lived. I want you to notice this. Jesus made himself a friend to the outcast, to the disenfranchised, to the reject. He took the initiative to make himself a friend of people in these categories. He healed the sick. He gave sight to the blind. He made the cripple to walk again. He comforted the lonely. He wept with the bereaved. He treated fairly every person that he came in contact with, even graciously. He treated them graciously. And then he said to his disciples, "Whoever has seen me has seen the Father." You see, the Father and Son are not rivals of each other. They're very much the same. They're very much alike. They're on the same page. But Jesus unveiled the Father as he had never been unveiled before. He gave the world a view of the Father that the world, unfortunately, had failed to see. He cast aside the image of God that depicts him as a dictator of terror, one who casts down thunderbolts to destroy those who make a technical mistake in their theology. Jesus cast aside that image completely. Or one who, before whom we must walk on eggshells. In his place, he paints an image of his Father as one who washes feet of his children, as one who binds up the wounds of the brokenhearted, as one who hangs on a cross so that his children don't have to. That's the God we serve. Let me ask you, are you walking on eggshells before God? Let me say to you this, you don't have to. You don't have to be afraid of hiding in terror from him, scared to death he's going to find out what you do. He already knows what you do. He knows what you've done. And right now he's waiting at the window, looking down the road, waiting for you to come home. And he has already a hug and a gold ring and a robe and some sandals and a fattened calf, and he's ready to have a feast because you've come home. That's the God you serve. Walking on eggshells is not necessary with our God because he gave it all in order to redeem us, regardless of the pig pen that we have been in, regardless of how far we have gone. He's waiting. He's waiting for us to come home. My challenge is for you to spread the word. Folks, we have great news to share. And the news we're talking about today is news that can be shared very matter-of-factly in moments of opportunity. When you are confronted by people, your loved ones, your friends, your children, your brothers and sisters, your neighbors, that you become aware of that just perceive God in an unhealthy, terrifying kind of way. And you can tell them God loves you. And tell them the story again about the prodigal son. And tell them that they don't have to walk on eggshells with God. He's dying to have them come home. That's my challenge for you today.